I'd like to introduce Peter Sinclair. And Peter Sinclair comes to us. He is the son of Mary Sinclair, who was a key player in the protest against the Midland nuclear power plant and the eventual cancellation of that project. And while Mary is no longer with us, her legacy lives on in that we do not have a nuclear power plant in Midland. And we really appreciate that. And we thank the Sinclair family for the efforts. And there was a lot of pushback at that time, and so we really appreciate that. Now, Peter, for the last 8 years, has been actively involved in the climate change, or monitoring the climate change, the news that's been going on, and he's been rated by Tree Hugger as being the sharpest climate denier debunker on YouTube. And since July of 2009, Peter has been posting to his well-known blog, Climate Crock of the Week, on his website, climatecrocks.com. If you haven't visited climatecrocks.com, you need to. It chronicles the climate change issues we face and provides a reporting perspective that you will not find in our news media. Over these last 5 years in particular of all this blogging, study and reporting, positioned Peter to have keen insight into the climate change issues and debate. And we are honored to have Peter here with us today. Thank you.
Okay, I gotta switch this computer over here. There we go. Great. Okay. We're gonna show a bunch of movies. I'm gonna give a little bit of an introduction here. Can we? What do we? Do we have control of the lights here? We can switch up some of those lights. As was mentioned, I've been deeply involved in this climate issue for the last 8 years. About 6 years ago, I've been giving climate talks. I was trained by Al Gore down in Nashville, and at that time I met a bunch of high-level climate scientists who I started learning from, and I was giving a number of talks around the state, and those talks gradually morphed into a video series called Climate Denial Crock of the Week, which I felt was important because I thought the climate science was getting really roughed up on the internet. Scientists were getting a lot of abuse on the internet, and nobody was really effectively pushing back. Because I had a background in graphic arts and animation and video, I thought maybe I would take a whack at it. And that series has now grown into well over 100 videos and became quite popular with scientists, so much so that I was offered the chance to do a second series, which started a few years ago, which is called This Is Not Cool. And that is in cooperation with something called Yale Climate Connections, which is an effort to kind of provide really good high-level information for journalists, academics, activists, and people that really want to kind of do deep dive into the information. And so now there are several dozen videos in that series as well, and you're going to see some of them in a few minutes. So as I mentioned, the climate scientists have really become my teachers and my mentors, and they really keep me honest. I'm on several mailing lists that include a number of scientists from our leading institutions like NASA and NOAA and our major universities. And I communicate with them electronically almost every day, and quite often in person. And in fact, in recent years, they've started inviting me along on their research trips. A couple of years ago, I went up to northwest Washington State on the Cascade Range, Eastern Glacier, with Dr. Maury Pelto, who's one of the leading experts globally on glacier ice and what's happening to it. And that was really an eye-opener for me in terms of understanding what it takes for these scientists over many, many years, over incredible physical hardships and even physical risk, to develop data point after data point to gradually pull this gigantic story together. And in more recent years, the last 2 years, I've been up on the Greenland ice sheet as part of a team called the Darksnow project. And in fact, I recommend when you go home, Google Darksnow or Darksnow project, because the whole effort has really gone viral in the last 6 weeks or so since we got back from our most recent trip. This is the Greenland ice sheet. This is a video I took in 2013, our first trip there, and I'll get more into just what's going on up there. But long story short, darksnow.org. If you want to make a contribution that is tax deductible, you can go there and do that. We're doing some work that is making global waves right now, and I'll be able to tell you more about it after you've seen some of these films. My partner in putting together Darksnow is Dr. Jason Box, one of the world's leading glaciologists. We've become good friends over the last several years. You might have seen him being interviewed by Ann Curry of NBC News, or more recently by Bill Maher in July, just before we left for Greenland this past year. So he's become a little bit of a media star, and I'm sort of the guy in the background running the camera and asking him questions. But it's been a lot of fun. It's been harrowing and illuminating. So what I'm going to do now is show some videos, and I've always in the past kind of done this long PowerPoint show because for the most part I've always felt like I had to kind of take people up from the fundamentals. And more I'm finding myself in front of groups like this where I think people kind of get the fundamentals. So I don't have to go through the carbon dioxide is like a blanket and it makes the earth warmer kind of thing. We can kind of do a little bit deeper dive. So what I want to talk about is one of the most concerning aspects of climate change, and that is what is happening to the ice caps, how rapidly they're melting, and what do we expect, what could possibly happen in terms of sea level rise due to that process. And that's what we've been investigating up in Greenland, so it's been a major focus for me over the last few years, and it'll give us just a little bit of, we can kind of hone in on that rather than spread ourselves all over. But if you have any questions about any other aspect of climate change, we can talk about those as well. So I'm just going to jump right into these. Let me give you a little bit of an intro here. I did this, the first one you're going to see I did not quite a year ago because I was kind of putting together a lot of puzzle pieces from a lot of different scientists, and I interviewed a number of scientists for this piece. And the basic idea is that we've changed the atmosphere of planet Earth, which happens over time, over long periods of time in history. We see that happen. The atmosphere does change over hundreds of thousands or even millions of years, but we've done it in a blink of an eye. So in a geological blink of an eye, we've changed the atmosphere of Earth to be much more like it was about 2.5 million years ago, an era that we call the Pliocene. So if you think saber-toothed tigers, woolly mammoths, no human beings, that was the Pliocene. And what we find consistently back through time is that when you have an atmosphere like we had in the Pliocene, which is very much like ours, 400 parts per million of CO2, which we've come to just over the last 100 years or so. What happens is the rest of the planet starts to adjust to that atmosphere. And normally it'll adjust smoothly over hundreds of thousands of years, but we're going to find out what happens when the planet has to adjust very rapidly. And if we go back to the Pliocene, what we see is an atmosphere very much like ours, but we see ice caps that are much smaller, and we see sea level that is 50, 60, even 70 feet higher than what we have today. And so what you're going to hear from the scientists is a little bit of explanation of why that is and what that might mean for ourselves and for our children. So I'm just going to run that, and then we'll continue.
We still are potentially revised its estimates of how unstable the Greenland ice sheet was.
Why should you care? What's up here is history, various times in the past, and along the top is the CO2 level at some interval in history, and along the side is the sea level that accorded with that. Now, if you do the absolute stupidest thing, which is you take the modern CO2, you run it over to the equivalent temperature from the linear interpolation, and you ask where 10% of the world's population is. I think it's fair to say that this is reason enough to be studying ice sheets and sea level.
While it takes a lot of ice to melt to raise ocean levels, they say that is in fact happening.
We have to keep additional warming less than about 1 degree Celsius if we want those ice sheets to stay close to their present size.
Greenland is very tightly tied to temperature, and if it gets too hot, it goes away. And too hot is not very many degrees above where we are now.
New research concludes that Antarctica is melting.
The ice sheets, for example, like Pine Island Glacier, are rapidly thinning, and the thinning is accelerating, and it's spreading further and further inland.
Until now, we haven't had direct measurements of how warm the water is or how fast that ice is melting. After 5 years of study and preparation, an international team of researchers has drilled through 500 meters of ice to install a series of instruments below the ice shelf to measure both ice loss and the temperature, salinity, and speed of the water. At one location, they found melt rates of more than 2 inches per day.
The last time it was 2 to 3 degrees Celsius warmer than it is now. Sea level was about 25 meters higher. That's 80 feet.
I have seen new paleoclimatic data that show that parts of the East Antarctic ice sheet, the one that is really considered very stable, they have been lost in the Pliocene. That's clearly demonstrated by some very convincing sediment data.
In the Pliocene era, some 3 to 5 million years ago, atmospheric levels of CO2 were similar to those humans are seeing today, yet sea levels were much higher. New data from ocean sediments indicates that warm temperatures during the period may have partially melted ice sheets, even the East Antarctic ice sheet, which scientists have up till now assumed to be very resistant to melt. Dr. Karis Cook described her recent findings to me.
From what we know about how ice sheets erode bedrock and deposit sediments offshore into the ocean, in order to erode those bedrocks, the ice sheet must have been retreated several hundred kilometers inland. There was no ice on Greenland, and that accounts for about 5 meters of global sea level. The West Antarctic ice sheet as well was probably gone, and that accounts for about 5 or 6 meters of global sea level. Now, what our retreat from the East Antarctic ice sheet did was that contributed an extra 10 meters of global sea level. So in total, we were looking at between 20 and 22 meters higher than they are today.
Now that wouldn't happen instantly, but we could get several meters of sea level rise in 1 century. In fact, the last time that ice sheets disintegrated was 14,000 years ago. Sea level went up 20 meters in 400 years. So that's 1 meter every 20 years.
Geologist Dr. Julia Brigham Greta has collected sediment cores in the Arctic regions from a unique Siberian lake that shows similar implications for the Pliocene era and our own.
We're seeing intervals in the Arctic back through the last few million years that are much, much warmer than anyone expected. So what this means is that when the West Antarctic ice sheet pulls back, we see a corresponding warmth in the high latitudes. Again, probably affecting the size of the Greenland ice sheet with major implications for changes in sea level. If we go back to the Pliocene, when we had a forested Arctic, probably no Greenland ice sheet, we're looking at a very long-term environmental situation when carbon dioxide may have been 400 parts per mil, like we are today. The value of our record is looking at the fact that the Arctic can become very quickly very warm, and that warmer environment is reaching a point where increasing melt of places like Greenland and the West Antarctic ice sheet are almost inevitable.
So, what they're trying to describe to you is that this is very important, because what you'll often hear from the climate denial side of things is that everything that we know about climate change is based on some kind of computer model. All of our predictions are based on something that came out of a computer, and that if even the slightest change in what goes into those models, and you end up with completely different outcomes. This is not the case. What we know and what we're concerned with about climate change is based on everything we know about the 4 billion year history of planet Earth. And simply going back through time over and over and over and over again as far as we can go, we find that carbon dioxide and temperature and sea level go together. They don't move instantly, but they do, over time, move together. Okay? So, now that we have changed our atmosphere, we are sure that we will begin to observe the ice sheets and all the other planetary systems begin to move to catch up. And in fact, that's what we are observing. So we had, I made that movie December last year. In about May, just 5 or 6 months ago, we had what a lot of the scientists would call a holy shit moment with a new paper by a very, very high-powered group, including scientists from NASA and elsewhere, that basically told us some pretty sobering things about what's happening both in Antarctica and in Greenland. So I'm going to show a movie about that right now, which sort of takes off right from this one and then moves it forward just a little bit with some of the more recent stuff. And you'll see interviews with Eric Renewable, who is held in almost reverence by his fellow ice scientists. He's considered more or less the gold standard in terms of glaciology.
There are some lessons from the past that make this particularly worrisome. One is a trace of sea level through time through the last deglaciation. So sea level was 120 meters lower during the last ice age. When it rose to form the interglacial world that we live in today, it didn't just rise in a smooth way, but it seemed to go in pulses. And in particular, there was this one interval called meltwater pulse 1A, which was a huge amount of water, a very large change in sea level in a very short time, and glaciologists aren't even sure where this water came from.
The big tipping point is the ice sheet stability. The danger is that we could get enough warming and begin to start the melting processes on the West Antarctic ice sheet and the Greenland ice sheet and cause those to become unstable and get a situation where it's out of our control. I think we're getting very close to that.
Another important story today, scientists warn that a large part of Antarctica is melting and cannot be stopped.
The area shown here in red, scientists say further degradation is almost certainly unstoppable. They say global warming is accelerating the pace of disintegration.
We are heading towards a particular sector of West Antarctica draining into the Amundsen Sea. This sector is drained by 6 glaciers. The biggest ones are Pine Island Glacier and Thwaites Glacier.
We passed the point of no return in this sector, and at this point we'll say it's just a matter of time before these glaciers completely disappear to sea. We are seeing in this sector retreat rates that we don't see anywhere else on Earth. There's probably nothing that can be done to stop this. It can be slowed down, but it's kind of difficult at this point to see any physical process that would stop it. This system is evolving very fast and is progressing exactly as you would expect if it was about to collapse to sea.
In this region of Antarctica, glaciers are anchored at the sea bottom to a point scientists call the grounding line. As more warm ocean water eats away at the underside of the ice, that grounding line has been steadily retreating, allowing even more warm waters to penetrate deep under the glacier. Multiple studies of this area show that the retreat of the grounding line has been accelerating in recent decades.
The ice sits on a high spot, and when it moves off of that high spot, it does not do so slowly and gradually, it jumps. This is a model. We did this with 3 different models in 3 different ways. Say if sea level is rising, I'm going to eventually float this ice, which is flowing from left to right, but on a perfectly smooth bed. That is what sea level rise or melting at the edge would do to the ice. It would thin and it would float, and it's not very exciting. Now, if we do the same thing here, except I put in a little topography, what would happen is that nothing, 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 it's sitting here, it's sitting here, it's sitting here, it's sitting here, watch. All the different classes and models that we've got do the same thing. This is where it is today. Forcing gets almost no response, forcing gets almost no response, forcing gets a huge response.
The new research shows no further obstructions between the current grounding line and the deep interior of West Antarctica.
As the glaciers retreat, they will follow these deep valleys. There is no mountain or big hill along the way that could act as a barrier to hold these glaciers back. The glaciers speed up, the grounding line retreat, the deep valleys that are sloping inland all reinforce each other to make the retreat of ice in this part of Antarctica unstoppable. And we think that this is what is happening right now.
The last time that ice sheets disintegrated was 14,000 years ago. Sea level went up 20 meters in 400 years. So that's 1 meter every 20 years.
NASA's lead polar ice researcher said, quote, "This is really happening. There's nothing to stop it now."
It in fact looks like this weak underbelly of Antarctica is in fact starting to flow out into the sea, and there's not a lot to hold it back.
Following publication of the new study, author Dr. Eric Renewable, writing in The Guardian, pointed out that while at the current rate of melt, the area might take 200 years to fall into the sea, evidence indicates the rate will continue to accelerate. Dr. Renewable pointed out that many similar glaciers in vast East Antarctica are less well studied. He wrote, just one of those, Totten Glacier, represents by itself a full 22 feet of sea level rise.
Okay, so I realize that the title of this is Can We Slow Down Climate Change? And I think the answer to that is yes. But what we have to bear in mind is that there's a whole lot of climate change that is baked into the system. And up until the last year or so, we could have still asked the question whether or not we're going to destabilize West Antarctica, and the answer to that we now know. It is destabilized. The question is, how fast is it going to go? And so the next question, you saw Dr. Richard Alley up there in the last two videos, considered probably the most well-known Greenland expert on the planet, certainly. And so his take on this is, right now, it's not Antarctica that's the biggest contributor to sea level rise. It's probably Greenland. We've had most of the sea level rise we've had up to this point has just been the water expanding, because warm things expand, they get bigger. And so the ocean has been expanding, and then gradually, it's been getting more input from melting ice. So now Greenland is taking over as kind of the biggest contributor, and will be for several decades into the future. At some point, Antarctica will take over, because Antarctica is 10 times as big. Okay, but Greenland holds something like 22 feet of sea level rise locked up in the ice there. It's 3 times the size of Texas, and the ice sheet is a couple kilometers thick. So if there's anything we can do to slow down Greenland, then we should really maybe take a look at that, because that could make a huge difference in buying us time to adjust to some of this other rise that looks like it's already baked into the cake. So it makes a huge difference for us in terms of civilization, or whether if we're going to get a 10-foot or 12-foot sea level rise, is that going to be over 500 years, or is it going to be over 100 years? That's a big difference. It might be the difference between catastrophe and merely a difficult time that we can adjust to. So, and that's really the kind of the key phrase that I'm hearing from scientists, is that we're going to have to adjust to that which is unavoidable, but avoid that to which we cannot adjust under any circumstances. So the Darksnow project has been looking at Greenland. And a little background, Dr. Jason Box is someone, he's a younger guy, he's in his 40s, but he's been traveling to Greenland and spending a lot of time there for 20 years, since he was a young college student. He knows the place like the back of his hand. He's truly one of the global experts on it, and he called me a couple years ago and said, would you like to go to Greenland? And I said yes. We knew each other because I'd interviewed him a few times, we talked a few times, and so we developed this partnership where we crowdfunded a trip using some of my internet videos. We pulled together enough money to go there in 2013 and again in 2014. And the puzzle piece that he's been looking at is an interesting one, because he published a paper in May of 2012 that pointed out that satellites show that Greenland is getting darker. The ice on Greenland is getting measurably darker, which means as it gets darker, it absorbs more sunlight, and so it melts faster. And he predicted in that paper that if this process were to continue, we would see a melt, we would see surface melt over Greenland, not just around the edges, which we normally see, but over the whole extent, even high, 10,000 feet high at the summit of Greenland, we would see melt. Well, and he predicted that we would see this within a decade. Well, it actually happened about 8 weeks after that was published in 2012. So we were there the next year to look at that 2012 layer and see what we could find there, to see if there's any evidence of what is making it darker. There's a number of candidates. There's things that make Greenland darker naturally, like pollen and sea spray and just the dust that blows out of the ground. But there's also human inputs like industrial soot, soot from shipping, airplanes, and increasingly wildfires, which are a product of global warming and are increasing. So this is what we're looking at. And also, more recently, we're looking at the algae and microbes that grow on the ice that are limited primarily by the fact that it stays frozen, and so they don't really have any water to work with. But as more of it melts, there's free water, so these things grow, and interestingly enough, they create little protective shells around themselves to protect them from the sun, which, trust me, is just brutal up there in the summertime. And the stuff that they create, this pigment, is the same stuff that's in your tea. It's the same pigment. So it darkens the ice, and it looks like, based on what we've seen this past summer, and we developed a tremendous amount of data, it looks like that might be a pretty important factor. So I'm going to show you this piece. This is the first piece that I did with new video that I shot this summer. So it's pretty exciting for me, and it talks about all of the various processes that are causing this speed up in Greenland melt. And just to give you a little background, 30, 40 years ago, people were thinking of Greenland as basically a big ice cube. And as it gets warmer, we'd see it sort of begin to melt, and the water would run off, and you'd see it kind of decline. What we understand now is that it's a lot more complex than that. As we get more surface melt, water is running around on the surface, but it doesn't stay on the surface. It finds a way to get down into the ice, and when it goes down into the ice, it takes heat with it. So areas of the ice that have been rock solid for millennia are being exposed to heat at a much more rapid pace than we would have believed or modeled 20, 30 years ago. And that, we believe, is in large part responsible for why the ice at the edges is softening, it's running off faster, and we're seeing much, much greater mass loss than we would have expected. So, yeah, hit that light again. We'll take a look at this one.
In the last 11 years, we have a high-quality satellite measurement of the mass of Greenland and Antarctic ice, and it shows a doubling of the mass loss rate in the past decade.
New data from the European Space Agency's Cryosat mission shows that the Greenland ice sheet, equal to 22 feet of sea level rise, has more than doubled its meltwater output in the last 5 years.
The water across the surface of this ice sheet is rampant, and it's causing untold damage to the base of the ice sheet. And it's doing that in deep interior regions that never before, not least in the last 10,000 years, have been susceptible to that warming.
In early August, the short summer is dwindling, and southwest Greenland no longer gets 24 hours of sunlight, descending into an eerie twilight for several hours each night. Streams, lakes, and ponds that cover the surface during sunny hours slow their flow and begin to freeze. When sunshine returns strongly, the melting process begins again. In areas where dust and algae darken the snow, the process is even more rapid, and streams quickly return to rushing torrents. Across the ice sheet, thousands of nameless, short-lived lakes dot the landscape.
Lakes have been forming higher up on the inland ice sheet. These lakes can be 9 square kilometers in area, and they form all over the ice sheet, many thousands of them. And these have been increasing in number and in area. Because of their dark color, they absorb sunlight. They're like big solar collectors.
One of the most striking and hazardous features of the Greenland ice sheet are the places where rushing water plunges deep into the ice, called moulins after the French word for mill. At these points, meltwater with all its stored heat penetrates deep into the ice sheet, and as melt areas expand, delivers warmth to regions that have been frozen solid for many millennia. This moulin is large enough to swallow a school bus.
A dramatic event that occurs with many of the lakes is they drain abruptly, sending an enormous volume of water down into the ice sheet, spreading out at the bed, lubricating the ice sheet flow, producing dramatic, fast accelerations. This increasing supply of meltwater draining into the ice sheet is adding heat to the ice, which softens the ice, leading it to flow faster under its own weight.
Meltwater continues to flow, in some areas reaching a calving front, where giant glacier walls push icebergs relentlessly into the sea.
The meltwater that's jetting out under the front of marine terminating glaciers, like a jacuzzi, forces a heat exchange with the warmer seawater that melts and undercuts the glacier front, promoting icebergs calving off. And that produces an instant flow acceleration because that's less flow resistance when bergs break off. So that's the direct connection between meltwater and flow speed at the glacier front. As the glacier flows faster, the cracks there, crevasses, they open up more, allowing more water to drain in. And this process we call hydrofracture, that water acting under gravity actually helps the cracks open up faster. This further promotes flow speed increase.
At every stage of the process, the flow of meltwater reinforces the other stages in a vicious cycle that accelerates loss of ice. It's what glaciologists call a positive feedback, accelerating ice loss in ways that scientists have only recently begun to quantify.
Greenland's sea level contribution 10 years ago was 0.5 millimeter per year. 10 years later, it's 1 millimeter per year. It's expected that that loss rate will continue to double with a period of somewhere between 5 and 12 years. So the next decade, Greenland's losing 2 millimeters per year. The next decade, 4 millimeters per year. The next decade, 8 millimeters per year. You take that to the end of the century, and the Greenland ice sheet is yielding about 1 meter of sea level just from Greenland. So the sea level projections that have recently been published by the IPCC are very likely underestimates because they don't contain all of the processes in the models that are used to make these projections.
Okay, so this is what we mean by feedback. In fact, scientists say positive feedbacks, and people think, well, that must be a good thing. But not really, not for us. The water moving on the surface gathers heat, it heads down to the bottom, it disperses the heat to the ice softens, just like a stick of butter you leave on your kitchen counter. It can move faster at the edges, and then it proceeds out to where he said how it jets out like a jacuzzi at the edge of the ice sheet, and then it draws warm water in and increases the calving off of those giant glaciers. And then every time one of those big calving events happens, we know from measurements that gets propagated up the ice stream, even 40 or 60 kilometers inland. The ice knows about it within an hour or so. And you can see it begin to lurch and move with each of those events. So every stage feeds into every other stage. And this is the thing that the general public really doesn't appreciate about climate change, that if they did, they would be a lot more concerned, is that we see this throughout the Earth system, these positive feedbacks. Okay, so that's the bad news. And we could go on, of course, but what I want to do is also provide you with very important information about what the solutions are for climate change. Because what we've realized is that where there's climate denial, where there's resistance to the science about climate change, in a lot of cases, it's because people don't like the solutions that have been presented. And I will say that there are people in the environmental community that are a little bit at fault for this, because there are some people out there who like the idea that the only way we can deal with climate change is 5 acres and a mule, and we'll all go back to no computers, no cars, living in caves kind of thing. In fact, I would maintain it's exactly the opposite is true. If we want to maintain something resembling the civilized lifestyle that we're accustomed to, we must move to renewable energy because we're not going to be able to maintain it using fossil fuels, certainly not on the scale that we have been. So I did my first piece on solutions. I've done this in the past as part of the Climate Croc series, but I hadn't done it in several years, and I talked my editor at Yale into doing a solutions piece, and he ended up really liking the results. So I interviewed a whole bunch of people who are working in the field deploying renewable energy, and as well as pulling a few things offline that I thought were really good. And when you put the whole story together, it's really quite compelling and surprising and even overwhelming if you haven't seen it presented in this way before. We're at a turning point with this energy. So hit the light, and I'll show you this one.
The world is almost entirely solar powered already. If the sun wasn't there, we'd be a frozen ice ball at 3 degrees Kelvin.
For the first time, we're going to buy solar under 5 cents a kilowatt hour, and that puts solar competitive with wind, competitive with natural gas, competitive with coal, and competitive with nuclear. In fact, it beats them all. And that's a revolution.
The company that brought you the iPod and iPad is shrinking its carbon footprint, building the nation's largest privately owned solar farm to run its data center in Maiden, North Carolina.
Not only are our buildings becoming much more energy efficient, they're starting to generate their own power on site
if I put solar on my rooftop, and when the sun is shining intensely and the solar panels are working to their optimum, my meter is actually running backwards because I'm generating more electricity than I'm actually using.
And even if a household can't afford to buy expensive solar panels, there are so many companies out there where you can lease the panels, no upfront costs, and it actually is cheaper on your
Pay zero upfront. We will install panels on your roof.
So let's get down to the dollars and cents of it all. Here's your old electric bill, and here's your new one. Plus what you'll pay to Sungevity to lease solar panels. Together, it's less than your old electric bill.
SolarCity purchases and installs the panel on the roof and then charges the homeowner or business owner a monthly lease payment, which is less than the utility bill.
Our power that we plug into is centralized in this country, centralized utilities, and it means the political power is centralized in utilities. And the radical promise of solar power for a Tea Party activist like Debbie or a lefty like myself, right, is decentralizing that power so that Southern Company isn't just controlling the power, people actually are controlling their own fate and power.
Of the $100 billion in renewable energy investment in Germany today, 50% of that is owned by people like you and me.
The most important thing that's happened in the renewable energy business in the last 10 years has been the precipitous drop in pricing for solar, especially utility-grade solar.
The solar thing in particular makes sense to a lot of conservatives back home.
We believe that this giant utility monopoly deserves some competition, and consumers deserve a choice.
You know,
it's just that simple.
This is music to my ears. I think this is where you and I can agree about monopolies, because when we talk about the energy market, we are not talking about anything that looks anything like a free market. It's not the market for cars, the market for shoes, the market for soda pop. In Georgia, right, you've got one company basically controlling your electricity, and consumers have no say in where that electricity comes from.
You are absolutely correct.
Because renewable energy offers the opportunity not only to offset climate-damaging gases from fossil fuel generation, reduce the risk from nuclear power, they also have this other possibility of changing the way we develop and own our electric power system.
You're kind of building a new type of distributed utility.
Exactly. What it amounts to is a giant distributed utility. And I think it's a good thing because utilities have been this monopoly and people haven't had any choice. So effectively it's the first time there's been competition for this monopoly because the utilities have been the only ones that own those power distribution lines, but now it's on your roof. So I think it's actually very empowering for homeowners and businesses.
In Europe, we now have millions and millions of small players, families, farmers, rural and urban residents, small businesses, cooperatives that are actually producing a huge amounts of solar and wind generated electricity at near zero marginal cost. 2 weeks ago on Sunday, and I want everyone to hear this, 75% of the electricity that powered all of Germany, and Germany is the most powerful economic capitalist market system in the world per capita. 75% of that electricity that powered all of Germany 2 weeks ago was solar and wind.
Then when we have something like lots of wind creating a lot of supply, that is more than the demand, and so prices can fall negative.
And that's why that day, the actual prices for electricity on the German grid went to negative, because the electricity was free.
As we all know, we've seen quite high wind speeds over the last few weeks. So it is generally just a winter phenomenon.
No, it can happen in summer as well, whenever there's a lot of solar energy, because Germany has been really adding a lot of renewable capacity. They have very ambitious 2020 targets, and so it's happening more and more. It could be for some hours, which is the intraday market, but these prices we've seen are for a whole day, for a day ahead, which is happening more and more as well. In fact, the companies are actually paying people to take electricity off them.
We said to the power companies, look, millions of people are now generating their own green electricity. Pretty soon, tens of millions. Within 20 years, hundreds of millions of buildings, offices, factories, and neighborhoods are going to create their own green electricity on the same curve that we've seen with computing.
Well, the old model's going to not work anymore. And smart utility executives are going to start finding different ways to make their companies profitable.
This is what happened with file sharing in music. This is what happened with Wikipedia. This is what happened with YouTube. When millions of small players come together and they create the software and the connections, their power overwhelms these old-fashioned nuclear and coal-fired and natural gas plants. It isn't even a competition.
This is a fundamentally different type of power plant, and it can spread much more rapidly than any of the other types of power production that we've seen in our history. That makes it a truly disruptive technology.
We say to the power companies, your job is no longer to create power, fossil fuel and nuclear power. Your job, your new mission, will be to manage the energy internet, because that's a technical proposition.
Historically, electric utilities have survived by selling electricity in volume, and the more they sold, the more money they made.
And what we said to them is, here's your new business model as a utility power company. You need to sell as little electricity as you can sell. The less electricity you sell, the more money you're going to make.
After all, people don't really want to buy electricity. They want the services that electricity provides, heating and cooling for their homes and their refrigerators and their computers and so forth. So the electric utility has to get into the business of providing those services by integrating and coordinating distributed generation located on the buildings and in other locations throughout the system.
But the old model of a generator selling to a customer, that single relationship is going to change, because the customer is going to be able to produce their own energy.
And you really picture a future where a majority of power in America, like within what, a decade or two, or within your lifetime, is solar?
I'm extremely confident that solar will be at least a plurality of power, and most likely a majority. And I predict it will be a plurality in less than 20 years. I'd say, I made that bet with someone.
The definition of plurality is?
More from solar than any other source.
So, very, very interesting moment that we're in right now. I've been to three conferences that were examining this issue just in the last couple of weeks. And we've been kind of dragging our feet in Michigan. There's a possibility that we might be on the verge of leaping forward a little bit. And it's interesting because you've got now a small but bipartisan group of legislators in Lansing who have done a brilliant bit of branding by putting together a suite of bills that will address this idea of making it easier for individual small businesses, communities, or co-ops to produce their own power. And they call it the Energy Freedom Act. Okay, so we can get the right-wing folks on board, we can get the left-wing folks on board, and get everybody together on this basic idea. Doesn't it make sense for us to be able to use this new technology? It's coming. And so it's very important that we create the regulatory environment so that our utilities will make rational decisions. They've been making rational decisions based on the regulations that we have imposed on them. And for the last 100 years, that's all been modeled on the idea that you build a big power plant, everybody taps into it, and you have captive customers. The technology says that's going away. It's just like internet, file sharing, cell phones, all of the distributed technologies that we've seen over the last 20 years, we've seen how fast they take over. And so we really need to, as a state, catch up with some of these other states that have gotten it, like California and Colorado and New Jersey and Minnesota, who are basically going to leave us in the dust if we don't wake up. And the comparison that I have seen made is to remember, I'm sure everybody can remember when AT&T was the big phone company. They were one of the biggest companies in the world. And then we broke them up because they were so big. So we had 5 baby bells, remember? And they were all wedded to phone lines. They were all monopolies in their various areas. And then cell phones came in. And now, some of these companies said, no, we really love our landlines. We think we're going to stay monopolies. This is our business model. We don't want to change. Those guys went away. Okay? They aren't around anymore. The companies, Verizon and AT&T, that embraced cell phones and decided that, yes, they were going to compete in that market, they're still around. Okay? And it's the same situation with renewable energy, particularly the photovoltaic solar, which is just coming on gangbusters. Yes, we're going to have a lot of wind. We're going to have a whole lot of other things too. But it is the rapid drop of photoelectric solar in the last 5 years that has really been a game changer that a lot of people did not see coming. And a big driver behind that was the policies that Germany set in place, which were far more successful than anybody imagined they would be, and drove those prices down really quickly. And now Germany is instituting some of those same technologies around energy storage, meaning Solar City. You saw Elon Musk up here. He's our modern Steve Jobs, right? His solar company, he has told us now, within 5 years, they expect that they will be packaging a battery system with every solar system that they sell. It'll just be standard. Because he is looking at how fast the prices for energy storage are coming down. It's following a similar curve to the solar cells themselves. And so what we're going to see in relatively short order is a situation where I can get off the grid because I'll have, if I have a decent site and enough solar panels, I'll be able to store as much power as I need, and I can just step away from the utility. Now, in reality, that may not be the ideal. Most observers think, well, we should have utilities, we'll need utilities, but just as the man said, their role is going to be to help distribute the energy, not so much generate it. And that's where we need to push our utilities to go. That's the direction they need to go in. Okay? So, we've got another half to our presentation here, and I don't want to hold that up, but there is...
Well, where we're at, Peter, is you were on the schedule to 2:30 with your talk,
okay.
And then we had 15 minutes for questions and discussion.
Well, let's do Q&A.
Okay.
Yeah, let's do Q&A, because, you know, we've talked about a lot of stuff. I've been talking all by myself.
Yeah, so we're really good for the schedule. We have, per the schedule, up to 2:45 for questions and discussion. If we, get done sooner than that, we'll move on to the next portion of the program.
And we can talk about things that I haven't talked about. I mean, there may be people here that have some serious questions about this whole climate change thing, and I'm very glad to see it if you do, or if you just want to get fleshed out on a few more details of some of the things that I talked about, I'm happy to do it, or we can talk about the solutions as well. So, jump right in. Yes?
A few comments. Since you were talking about the solar photoelectric, even the best photovoltaic, and I don't keep up with it, let's say it's around 20% efficiency.
Efficiency, right. Okay.
That means 80% of that heat that's being taken from the sun is just being wasted. Most of the energy that an ordinary person uses in a single family house is for heating or cooling. Mm-hmm. So for heating, if there's a way if you're going to put a solar collector on, mm-hmm. collect the heat as well as the electrical energy that you get from it. Collect the heat, and in the winter, we do have winter here. 100 years ago, before refrigerators, people collected ice and stored it and used it all summer.
Sure.
Of course, it was only for their mill, but we could use it for more things too, if it's done. And we have much better insulation today mm-hmm. than we had back then. So that's a comment on that. A comment on the first part. It seems to me the big problem with the whole climate change argument is the lack of education. How many people here are less than 20 years old?
We have one over here.
Why?
There's one.
Okay, it's an education thing.
I talk to a lot of schools.
Yeah, most of what you need to know about climate change can be explained by ordinary high school science.
Yep.
You don't need anything more than that.
Yeah.
That's all.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. We've got some people that don't believe in science anymore, but that's a whole.
Well, then the thing is, if you break it down, what part of basic science do you have to discard in order not to believe it? I mean, is the sun hot or not? You know, it gets to be that simple. You know, is there?
I get it.
Yeah.
You know, I get it. It gets. You know, I spend a lot of time going back and forth with people, especially online, who've got a bone to pick with me. So I'm familiar with all the arguments.
Oh, of course.
But
I don't
I do talk to a lot of high schools, so I talk to hundreds or even thousands of kids at a time.
But is it in the curriculum?
It is in the Michigan high school curriculum. It is, and that's why people like having me come in, because then it takes it off their plate. They can just, we had the guy come in, he gave the spiel, good to go. So that is happening, and that is the basis of a lot of fights that are going on around the country. You may be familiar with the Texas school book controversy. Texas buys more school books than almost any other state, maybe besides California, and so the way that the type of school book that they determine they want to have has a big impact on a lot of other states. So what the climate denial industry has done is they've seated a lot of people on the little body that determines those standards for Texas school books. And the climate deniers, the fossil fuel industry, has made this kind of a deal with the devil with the hardcore fundamentalists who want to teach kids that the Earth is 5,000 years old. By the way, there's no such thing as climate change. And so we've got a fairly robust movement of people that would like to, in essence, destroy scientific education in this country. So that's fertile ground for anybody that wants to, you want to get active on an issue in your community. Get with the school boards and make sure that science teachers are supported. Because my wife's a teacher, and trust me, there are phone calls every year as soon as you step outside of some kind of right-wing orthodoxy, whatever it might be, and not every administrator has the backbone to stand up to that. So they need parental and community support to maintain that.
The final comment would be, what about the population?
Well, I get asked that every time, and the answer is we've got 7 billion people. We're going to get probably 2 billion more before we level off. There's some hope that we will level off. But we're talking about essentially 2 more Chinas that are on the way. Okay? Now, unless this Ebola thing gets a whole lot worse, God help us, these people are coming, they're on the way, there's nothing we can do to stop them, so we better determine that we are going to make these people feel welcome and nourished and supported, because we don't really have a choice if we want to have a peaceful world. Because it is leaving people in poverty and squalor and want is simply not in the cards for a civilized planet. It is not compatible with civilization. So hopefully with some of these renewable technologies, which are really an ideal answer in the tropics, where a lot of this population growth has happened, where they don't have a grid yet. These renewables can really fill in those gaps and do so relatively quickly if we provide the right kind of support and incentives to make that happen. And it's ironic that what you hear from a lot of climate denial types is, oh, we don't want to deny the benefits of fossil fuels to all the poor people in the developed world. Now that in itself, if you know the record of the fossil fuel industry in the developing world, that in itself is a bit of a laugher, but it simply does not meet up with the facts on the ground, which is that with a solar cell the size of a paperback book and a light bulb the size of a grain of rice, I can make it possible for a child to read at night. Game changer, right there. And so the alternative is for them to wait 20 or 30 or 50 years for the grid to be built out at great expense to wherever they are, or for them to be driven into a city and become part of some squalid mega structure. So it's really renewable energy that offer the greatest hope for lifting the standards of the developing world without breaking the ecosystem worse than we're already breaking it. Yeah?
The bill that you mentioned, the bipartisan bill, where, what was it called again?
Energy freedom.
Energy freedom. Has that passed?
No, it's making its way through, you know, that labyrinth.
Yes.
But very hopeful, you know, bipartisan, and I think there's real hope for that. So if you Google it, I know it comes up. You know, Michigan Energy Freedom Act. There should be some information on that. So you know what I know as of now. Yes, sir.
Those are on the Michigan legislature. I've been following it. You can't ride an electric bicycle on state roads now.
You cannot?
No, they've outlawed that. I mean, electric motorcycle, yes, electric moped, electric bicycle, no. Just around town. You can't take it on a state highway, not a freeway. You can't take it on you can't take it on field stuff. You can't.
So I can take a motorcycle, but not an electric.
Not an electric moped or a bicycle. They passed it. Well, that's just one. Another thing, Walmart sells solar cells all over the country except for 4 states, Michigan being one.
Yeah.
Because our legislators, our Republican-controlled legislation, have passed a deal where you can't disrupt the power grid. So you can't have more power than your home is going to make.
Right.
You can't be selling your power to the grid.
Yeah, it's really hard.
Yeah, they've done everything to stay. So it seems like our real problem here isn't just so much technological, it's political. It's the Michigan legislature. I mean, Eric Nesbitt's our district rep. He's also the chairman for ALEC.
Yeah.
You know,
sure.
I mean,
well, okay, so
the energy business. Yeah, our problem really is the money in politics.
Okay, well, I agree. But you said you were at the march last week.
Right.
300, 400,000 people in New York. Game changer.
So.
That message has not been lost. And you mentioned ALEC. The day after the march, Google dropped its support for ALEC, followed by Facebook and Yelp. Microsoft did a few months ago. So these are industries. These are our growth core industries that, for their living, depend on attracting smart young people, and smart young people now get it that climate change is a real deal. So they know they can't survive unless they flee from the troglodyte group.
Well, money in politics, money in the media was the big issue during March.
You're absolutely right about money in the politics. That's a whole other ball of wax and another area where I hope people can get active, you know. But just doing what we're doing, we're pushing the conversation in a really positive direction. Okay, it needs to go faster.
Yeah.
But you know, but if you make the solutions palatable to these far right guys, they find it really tough to take that back to their own constituency who are seeing the idea that, gee, I'd like to have solar panels on my roof, you know? So it becomes more and more difficult for them to stay in that little reservation of climate denial when the renewables are, you know, just becoming so much of a logic of their own, you know? Yeah?
Two questions. First, have you followed the work of Amory Levins and the Rocky Mountain Institute over the years?
Sure.
Well, one of the differences between what I hear you saying and what they're doing is they are trying to integrate communities and help them reduce all of the costs of installing this, but they're bringing in a whole community element rather than just a technical fix element.
Mm-hmm.
And you know, the kind of follow-on point is that I don't hear any kind of effort to do ecological footprints of what this means for biodiversity, what it means for food production, what it means for biological and ecological processes upon which we depend.
You're talking about the impact of climate change or the impact of the
technologies.
Renewable technology.
I mean, you have more energy, then you still go out and buy things. You buy a car that's going to has a huge energy footprint.
Yeah.
And so you have to follow the whole footprint to see what's really happening. And probably when Maynard gives his talk, I'll add some about, we have a very inaccurate perception of what happened with the Little Ice Age, and that there's some really significant work there that helps us understand the connections between plague outbreaks, volcanic eruptions, locust outbreaks, food riots during that whole period. We had 30-year war, among other things, and that they didn't see the connections. And I don't think we see all the connections at the global level now.
Well, I mean, we just started bombing in the Middle East again. Now, a big part of this instability that we've seen in the Middle East is related to climate. Because if you look back a few years, in 2010, you had a massive, massive heat wave in Russia. And forest fires burning all over the place. Tens of thousands of people died from respiratory problems because of the forest fires. Russia banned the export of their grain that year because they were so short of grain. There was also a crimp in supplies in Australia and Argentina due to weather extremes that were going on there. So what you saw in 2010 is food prices spiked. And by early 2011, you had riots going off across the Middle East that were greatly dependent on the grain prices. So that sparked this whole Arab Spring uprising, and Tunisia went down, and Libya, and Egypt, and then Syria, which has been in a serious drought since 2007 that has displaced hundreds of thousands of people, is now a failed state.
Right.
So this is the kind of thing that actually a lot of people have been thinking about, particularly in our military and intelligence units, of the effects of the knock-on effects of climate change. And they are geopolitical. In fact, from my perspective, during the lifetimes of just about everybody in here, those are probably going to be the most severe effects that we see is destabilization of states, particularly in the developing world, due to severe severe climate events like droughts and floods. 2000, I believe it was that same year, 2010, huge, while they were having massive droughts in Russia, the same weather system, the same kink in the jet stream was causing massive, massive flooding in Pakistan.
Oh.
Okay, so Pakistan is a developing country that is politically not as stable as we would like it to be, and is nuclear armed. Okay, so a huge impactful weather event like a drought, which is kind of developing there now, following these massive floods that they've had, it could possibly have global impacts if it leads to some folks taking power there that really don't share any values with us at all.
Well,
so you make a good point in that regard.
Well, but I mean, the larger point is that, you know, we have to rethink the modern industrial era. And because industrial agriculture, big food, big agriculture, big pharmaceuticals, these are huge oligopolies which are some of the root causes of, you know, not really saying we have to try to figure out strategies which will enable us to work through, hopefully muddle through. But we need all these biological, ecological systems to be healthy and not be based on an exploitative model. They need to be based on kind of a regenerative model.
Totally get it.
And so, I mean, that's just, I don't hear, I mean, not.
Well, you know, let's make it invite me back for a 4-hour program, and we will go into all of that stuff. Trust me. My son is in sustainable agriculture at MSU and is helping to run the sustainability program that they just started up in the UP, which is trying to spread community food systems and sustainability throughout the Upper Peninsula.
Right.
I think you know, what Amory Lovins would be completely on board with everything you're saying, but what some people will say is, well, we'll use this renewable energy, or we'll save energy. It doesn't help us, for instance, to have more efficient cars because people will just drive more.
Yeah.
You hear that. And my reaction to this, and I think Amory Lovins would say the same thing, gee, I bought a more efficient car and I like it so much I'm driving to work twice. You know, that's not going to happen. You know, so Amory Lovins has in fact directly taken that particular argument on. It's called Jevons paradox is the name of that, and he just says, you know, basically, you know, it is a good thing to save energy. It is a good thing to deploy more efficient cars, more efficient appliances, things of that nature. And we're learning how to manufacture and distribute this stuff with greater efficiency all along the line. So it takes people like yourself to keep pushing that idea, and especially being mindful in your own life, you know, what kind of things you buy, especially what kind of food you buy, because that has a huge impact. But yeah, I am definitely thinking of these things, and absolutely invite me back, and we'll have like a long form discussion where we go into all of that. Yes, sir.
We sat on the bus from Detroit to the Climate Change March. We sat next to some kids that were in that sustainability program up in the UP.
Is that right?
And they'd come down and they were on the bus with us. So exciting. My wife and I were there at the event. We marched with the Vandana Shiva's group in the thing. And the big diversity of people, very exciting, very encouraging.
Yeah.
But then looking at policy and the very kind of weak policy response that we heard from the Obama administration and others, you know, they're listening, but it was still weak.
Mm-hmm.
So, you know, we're looking ourselves, and we're looking out there, you know, there will be a paradigm shift. We chatted about this briefly before the presentation, just like there was with civil rights, just like there was with abolition of slavery. There was a paradigm shift. But, what will cause that? And I'm looking out there and I'm seeing these accelerated processes. You mentioned the acceleration from the forcing effects. And I have a question for you about the methane releases and the acceleration of methane release from the permafrost.
Yeah.
And what I don't understand as well is how the methane would break down. So if we have this immense release of methane, what's the impact of that on the process? I know we can pull some carbon back in, but how do we counteract methane? And also, what's the effect of the releases of carbon dioxide on oxygen levels? I was recently reading about oxygen levels, so I threw a couple things out there.
Okay.
Methane and oxygen.
Okay, first of all, oxygen, don't worry about oxygen.
No?
Yeah, there's a measurable change, measurable because we can measure things at the parts per million level in oxygen on the planet related to the amount of fossil fuels that we've been burning. We're pulling carbon out of the ground, we're combining it with oxygen when we burn it, and so we're pulling a little bit of oxygen out of the air, but that is not a concern in terms of any human safety or any impact on natural systems from that. It's an interesting factoid. It helps us to understand the larger macro process that's going on, but it is not any kind of an imminent impact. Okay. Now, the big one that you brought up was methane. Okay.
Yeah.
And that's a two-part problem. Everybody knows methane is natural gas, like you burn in your home. It is created naturally by some kind of systems like swamps. Will have a certain output of methane. So there's a background that the planet produces a certain amount of methane, and we have a few thousand parts per billion naturally in the atmosphere. It's an important gas because it's, depending on how you measure it, it's 20 or 50 or 100 times more powerful than CO2 as a greenhouse gas. So it's a big deal. And we can look back in history and we see times when it's gotten really warm, or relatively fast, not as fast as today, but relatively quickly. And we think that methane releases might have had something to do with that. And the methane that we're concerned about is twofold. And one is we have permafrost up in Siberia and Canada and Alaska, frozen ground. And as it thaws out, and I've got a video on this, so you can, Peter Sinclair, methane.
Thank you.
Yale, you probably find it, or email me and I'll point you to it. I interviewed Dr. Charles Miller, who is the point man scientist for NASA, who has been flying over the Canadian Arctic at low altitude for several years, measuring the methane output. What happens is the permafrost softens up, it melts, so that bacteria that are naturally there can begin to become active. They eat the organic matter that's in the soil and they release either carbon dioxide or methane. Okay? And there's a whole heck of a lot of that organic matter that's up there. And as more and more of it melts, we're going to see more and more of that come out as methane. Okay? Now, what Dr. Miller said to me is that their results are a little bit shocking in the amounts of methane that they're seeing, where they can be flying over these desolate areas of tundra where there's just absolutely nothing there, and they're picking up methane concentrations as if you close your eyes, you think you're flying over a refinery. Okay? And so the question that we need to answer over time is, how much of that is background, how much of that is new, and how rapidly is that evolving? And the answers are fairly sobering. That is definitely a feedback effect that is out there that we're really concerned about. Now, there's another piece of the puzzle, and it's important to kind of keep these separate. You've got the methane that could come out of the tundra, but then you also have methane that is frozen under the ocean. Okay, methane clathrate. This was 50 years ago was considered kind of a scientific oddity, that there were some places that was deep enough and cold enough where the methane gas could actually freeze, and it kind of bonds with the water molecules in a peculiar way. And now what they're telling us is that basically the more they look, the more of the stuff they find. There is a ton, megatons of methane that are down on the ocean bottom. And so the concern is, as we warm the ocean, are we going to see some of this stuff begin to bubble out? Now, much of it is down deep enough and it's cold enough, so it's not really of a concern right away. But we have some data that started to be developed about 10 years ago by a group out of Fairbanks, University of Alaska Fairbanks. They've got some scientists up there who are Russian, so they're real familiar with the East Siberian area, and they've been going up there in the East Siberian Sea and the Laptev Sea and the Arctic, where the ice has been pulling back. And so there's more warmth getting into that ocean area, and so the other piece of it is that's really kind of shallow. It's relatively shallow. It's like I'll say 70, 80 meters in big parts of it. So it's not terribly deep. So the concern is that more warm water is getting to the methane down there, and they're telling us, this group is telling us, that there are places where this methane is starting to seep out. Or at least they're finding plumes. They're finding areas where there's a lot of methane coming up. Now, they've been looking for 10 years, and they're fairly alarmed about this. But the question everybody else is asking, and I've talked to the head of the U.S. Geological Survey's task force on this. Okay, I'm working on a piece on this. This is a very, very big piece. And the mainstream science take on this is, yes, there's methane down there. Yes, we're worried about it. We don't see it as being a world-shaking thing in the coming century. Okay? That's the mainstream scientific view. But you've got these scientists out there who are saying, they're screaming, we're seeing these methane plumes. So what we need is a longer period of observation to figure out, is this background? You know, does this always happen? Is this planet just sort of used to this, and so it, it just sort of gets absorbed and it's part of the system? Or is this new, and is it growing? And is this something that could be really, really catastrophic? Because Jason Box, my partner, had tweeted this past summer because he's very concerned about this, and he was reading some reports from a new group, a Swedish group, that went up to those same areas and is finding some of the same readings, some of the same very alarming readings. Now, they have not published yet. They have not subjected their work to peer review. This is all just stuff that they're kind of putting out, like press release stuff, okay? But what Jason tweeted was, if even a small fraction of the methane that is locked up in the Arctic comes out, we are effed, okay? And effed went viral like crazy. Right. And it was funny. We got back from Greenland, and Jason opens up his laptop, and it's like his Twitter feed had tripled, and his wife called and said, "You're front page news in Budapest," So yeah, this went really viral, and so it's something I'm looking at really hard right now. I will tell you, there are some real hardcore catastrophist people, especially on the internet, that just have their hair on fire about this, and it's going to kill us all in the next 20 years and all that stuff. So I would say throw a damper on that for now, because that is not the mainstream science. There are very powerful reasons to be concerned. I'm concerned. Jason is concerned. A lot of people concerned. But we are not in any position to say that this is some kind of rampant, imminent disaster, but it is certainly out there, and it's one of the feedback effects that we're most concerned
Well,
about.
what's the natural cycle to pull that back? I mean, what's the breakdown?
We need to, because we're running short on time,
Right.
I'd like to take one more quick question from the audience, and then I'd like to rephrase the question that is the title of the workshop today is what can, we'll rephrase
Yes.
that question, but
We can continue. One more, yeah.
It's just sort of a sidebar, but you're talking about the ice melting off the Antarctic and Greenland.
Yes.
What happens to the crust?
The Earth's crust, when the ice melts, that's a great question, because there are parts of like North America and Europe that are still rising from the last time we were covered with a mile of ice. You know, this area was covered with a mile of ice, and some parts geologically are still rising now, and then some parts rise and it causes other parts to sink. And there are some people that say, some real scientists that say that as we start to lose a fair amount of ice, we may get into triggering volcanism and earthquakes and things like that in areas where maybe we haven't seen before because of changes in the crust. But I would say
It's so fast.
well, that's still a process that's not at the top of our list of worries. Okay, it's out there, but it's, you know, don't let yourself be focused on that one. That's sort of like down the pipe. Yeah, that's down the pipe. Okay, so.
okay. The last question I'd like to pose to Peter is the question that's the title of this workshop. Can climate change be slowed down? And I want to add this twist to it, is what, at a personal level, in your opinion, can I do, a single person, what can a single person do to have the most, my own personal impact to help slow climate change down?
Okay, yes, climate change can be slowed down. We have to understand there's a certain amount of change that's baked into the system. We're not going to get away with it. And what I have to explain this to my kids because they know what I do. And I say, look, you know, we've got a bottleneck in the next 60 to 100 years. We've got to get through. We've got to get through with as much of humanity as possible and try to get to a place where we're a sustainable civilization. And the fact is, the planet is going to take a hit. And the job of our lifetime is to make sure that that hit is a 2% hit or a 5% hit and not a 25% hit or an 85% hit. Okay? So I believe, and an awful lot of people still believe, that we can make these changes and we can make them fast enough to head off some of the real nightmare scenarios that are out there. And, you know, we could go on and on about what those nightmare scenarios are. But what individuals can do, there's a continuum, and there's what you can do as an individual. I suspect that most of the people in this room have taken steps that are very sensible ones. You know, when I moved into my house 20 years ago, it was a very drafty, typical 50s style ranch house, and over that time I have taken steps to make it much tighter, much more efficient, much warmer in the winter, much cooler in the summer. So I'm convinced that it uses a lot less energy, and as the technology evolves, I'll continue to take more steps to make it a much better place to live. The car that I drove down here gets 48 miles a gallon, whereas my old car only got 30 miles a gallon. I ride my bike as much as possible. These are all good things to do. But maybe more than anything else is doing what those 400,000 people did last week, which is make your voices heard, and not just on the street somewhere in New York, but in your community, at your church, in your bridge club, at your garden club, to your representatives, to people in the media, because up until last week, people in the media were still saying nobody gives a damn about climate change. Even though all the polling is very clear. The number of people who care about climate change is now a majority, okay? And the news articles that you see, well, it's not their top priority. Well, no. My job is a priority, my family is a priority, my next meal is a priority. But climate change is very important to a lot of people, and it can affect votes, okay? And the hardcore climate denial politicians are more and more being taken to task for this, and it's starting to bite on them, okay? So make that a priority. If you just do one thing a week or one thing a month, you know, you bring that up in conversation, or you send that letter, or send that email, or sign that petition, or do whatever you can to make another ripple, make another wave that indicates you give a darn about this, and that is a priority for you. And that message is getting through. It got through to Google, got through to Facebook, got through to Yelp, and it's getting through to politicians little by little by little. So that's the main thing.
Thank you very much.